My name is Rachel Donovan, I'm 34 years old, and I live in Columbus, Ohio. I'm writing this down because I need anyone to understand what happened in the 72 hours after my father died. I've told this story to my husband, to my therapist, to a detective, and now I'm telling it to you, because I genuinely believe people need to hear it before it happens to them too. This is the story of how I lost my father, found out my own brother had been lying to my face for months, and discovered a kind of betrayal I didn't think existed inside my own family. There's a twist at the end. I promise you won't see it coming, because I didn't either, and I lived it. The diagnosis. My dad, Walter Donovan, was 68 years old. He built a small but successful HVAC company from nothing, Donovan Heating and Air, over 35 years in our hometown outside Columbus. He started it with one used van and a box of tools in 1989, and by the time he got sick, it employed 14 people and was worth, according to the accountant who eventually got involved, somewhere around $2.3 million when you counted the property, the equipment, and the contracts. My dad was the kind of man who shook your hand too hard and called everyone champ, even people he'd just met. He coached my little league team for exactly one season before admitting he knew nothing about baseball and switching to assistant coach for soccer instead, which he also knew nothing about, but he showed up every single Saturday for 6 years. He cried at my wedding so hard my husband, Mark, had to hand him a second tissue. He was, in every way that mattered, the best man I knew. In February of last year, he was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctor gave him somewhere between 4 and 8 months. He lasted 5. I want to be clear about something before I go further. This story isn't really about money. I know how it sounds. I know that any story that starts with my father left me his estate sounds like greed wearing a sad mask. But I need you to understand that what happened to me wasn't about the money at all. It was about finding out that the person I trusted most in the world after my father, my own brother, had been planning something in the dark while I sat by my dad's bed every single night holding his hand. My brother is Derek Donovan. He's 2 years older than me, 36, and for most of our lives, I would have told you he was my best friend. We grew up sharing a bedroom wall thin enough that I could hear him crying after our parents' brief divorce scare when we were kids. They got back together within a year. We were close. Or at least, I thought we were. When Dad got sick, Derek and I made an unspoken agreement. I would handle the day-to-day caregiving. I lived 20 minutes from Dad's house. Derek lived in Cincinnati, 2 hours away, with his wife Stephanie and their 2 kids. Derek would handle the business side, which mostly meant talking to the accountant and the company's general manager, a guy named Pete who'd worked for my dad for almost 20 years. For 5 months, I drove to my dad's house almost every single day. I quit my part-time job at a marketing firm to do it. Mark and I could afford it for a while, barely, and I didn't care. I helped Dad shower when he could still stand. I held a bucket when chemo made him sick before he stopped chemo altogether in month 3 because his body couldn't take it anymore. I read him the sports section every morning because his eyes got too tired to focus on small print. I learned how to give him his pain medication injections when the hospice nurse wasn't there. I slept on a cot in his living room for the last 6 weeks of his life because he was scared of being alone at night, and he never had to be. Derek visited on weekends. Sometimes. He had a demanding job in commercial real estate, and Stephanie's parents needed help with their own health issues, and the kids had soccer and dance, and I understood, I really did, at the time, that everyone has limits. I never once made him feel guilty for not being there as much as me. I told myself love isn't a competition, and showing up looks different for different people. What I didn't know was that handling the business side meant something very different to Derek than it meant to me. The will. My dad had a will drafted back in 2019, 3 years before his diagnosis, with a lawyer named Harold Bremer, an old family friend who'd done legal work for Donovan Heating and Air since the early 2000s. I'd seen a copy of this will once, back when Dad first had us sign some related paperwork as part of a just-in-case conversation he insisted on having at Thanksgiving that year, the kind of conversation every responsible parent has and every adult child dreads. The terms were simple and, frankly, generous to both of us. The house, paid off and worth around $310,000, would go to me, since I'd been the one local and most likely to need stability. Dad's words, not mine. Donovan Heating and Air, the actual business, would be split 50-50 between Derek and me, with the stipulation that Derek, who actually had business and finance experience, would run day-to-day operations, but profits and any future sale would be divided equally. There was also about $180,000 in savings and investment accounts, also to be split evenly. All told, after the house, it came to almost exactly $500,000 each, give or take. I want to repeat, this was the will from 2019. 3 years before Dad got sick. Nobody manipulated him into that one. It was fair, it was thoughtful, and frankly, looking back at it now, it was the last completely honest version of my father's wishes that existed. In April, 2 months after the diagnosis, Dad told me he wanted to update some things with Harold Bremer. I assumed this was normal. Lots of people revisit their estate planning after a serious diagnosis, often just to confirm healthcare directives, power of attorney, that kind of thing. I drove him to Harold's office myself. Derek couldn't make it, he had a closing on a property deal that week. I sat in the waiting room while Dad met with Harold for almost 90 minutes. When he came out, he looked tired but lighter, the way you look after you've made a decision you've been putting off. He told me in the car, just tidied some things up, Raj. Made sure everything's clear for you and your brother. Don't want you two fighting over anything when I'm gone. I didn't push for details. He was my dad, dying, and I trusted him completely. That was my first mistake, not pushing, not asking to see the document myself. I trusted that whatever he decided would be fair, because he had always been fair his entire life. What I now know, what I learned weeks after he died, is that the April 2022 update didn't change much. It mostly clarified the healthcare directive and named me as his medical power of attorney, since I was the one actually present for doctor's appointments. The financial terms of the will stayed essentially the same as 2019. Harold confirmed this to me later, very explicitly, in a meeting I'll get to. But there was a second visit. One I didn't know about. One that happened on October 14, the night my father died. The night he died. By October, my dad was in home hospice. He'd stopped eating solid food 2 weeks earlier. The hospice nurse, a kind, weathered woman named Carol who'd been with us for the final stretch, told us privately that we were likely looking at days, not weeks. I called Derek and told him to come. He drove up from Cincinnati with Stephanie that same afternoon and stayed at a hotel 15 minutes from Dad's house, planning to be close by. On the night of October 14, my dad was in and out of consciousness. He'd have lucid moments, sometimes asking for water, sometimes asking about the Buckeyes game, sometimes just looking at me and squeezing my hand, and then he'd drift off again for hours. Derek came by around 6 p.m. and sat with him for a bit. I remember being grateful he was there. I remember thinking, this is good, we're both here, this is how it should be. Around 8 p.m., Derek told me he was going to step out to grab some dinner and make a few calls and that he'd be back. I said sure, of course, go. I stayed with Dad. Carol the hospice nurse was there too, checking vitals every hour or so. At approximately 9:40 p.m., according to Carol's later notes, my father had a brief moment of lucidity. He asked for water. He looked at me and said, "Rachel, you've been so good to me." Those were, as far as I know, close to his last coherent words to me directly. He drifted off again around 10 p.m. Derek came back around 10:15 p.m. He said he'd grabbed food at a diner nearby and made some work calls he couldn't put off. I didn't think anything of it. Why would I? My father was dying. The last thing on my mind was auditing my brother's whereabouts. At 11:52 p.m., my father passed away peacefully, with me holding one hand and Carol checking his pulse, confirming what we already knew. Derek was in the room too, standing near the foot of the bed. I remember the silence after Carol said the words "he's gone." I remember Derek's face, and I want to be honest, because I've replayed this moment 1,000 times since. I remember thinking his face looked strange. Not just grief-stricken. Something else underneath it that I couldn't name at the time. I told myself it was shock. People process death differently. I had no reason, in that moment, standing over my father's body, to think my brother's strange expression meant anything other than grief. I now know what that expression was. It was guilt. The reading. The funeral was 8 days later. Over 200 people came, former employees, customers whose furnaces my dad had personally fixed at 2 a.m. in the middle of January over the decades, neighbors, his church group, 2 of his old army buddies from his 20s. It was, by any measure, a celebration of a life well lived, and for a few days Derek and I were united in grief in a way that felt like it healed some of the distance the past 5 months had created. We hugged. We cried together. We told stories about Dad on the back porch with a bottle of his favorite wild turkey. I thought, for a brief window, that whatever had felt slightly off between us during the caregiving months was behind us now, replaced by shared loss. Harold Bremer scheduled the will reading for 12 days after the funeral, which he said was standard to allow time for immediate arrangements to settle. Derek, Stephanie, Mark, and I all sat in Harold's office on a grey Tuesday morning in early November. Harold opened a folder and said something that made my stomach drop before he'd even finished the sentence. "Before we begin, I need to disclose that there's a complication. There appear to be 2 competing documents." He explained that the will on file, the one he had drafted and notarized, the one reflecting the April update, left the estate essentially as I described, the house to me, the business split 50-50, savings split evenly. That was the will Harold had prepared, and that, as far as he was concerned, was legally operative. But Derek's attorney, and this was the moment I learned my brother had hired his own attorney, separately, without telling me, had submitted a different document to probate court 3 days after Dad died. This new document, dated October 14, the night my father died, named Derek as sole executor and primary beneficiary of nearly everything, the business in full, 70% of the savings, and a provision granting him first right of refusal to purchase the house from the estate at a steeply discounted assessed value, effectively letting him take the house too if he wanted it. I remember the room going completely silent except for the hum of the office's old fluorescent lights. I looked at Derek. He didn't look at me. "Derek," I said. "What is this?" He finally looked up. "Dad wanted to update things. He called me that night. He said he'd been thinking about it for weeks, that he wanted me to have the business outright since I'm the one with the experience to run it, and that it wasn't fair to keep splitting things when I was going to be doing all the work managing it long term." "He called you," I repeated. "While I was sitting 20 feet away in his living room. He texted me to come to the den." "You were dealing with Carol." "It was quick." I want to be honest about my emotional state in that moment because I think it matters for understanding everything that happened next. I did not scream. I did not throw anything, although God knows I wanted to. I sat very still, and I felt something inside my chest that I can only describe as a structural collapse, like a building whose foundation just silently gave way. No explosion, just a quiet, sickening settling into rubble. Harold cleared his throat and said the document Derek's attorney submitted had some irregularities that the court would need to examine. It wasn't drafted by Harold, it used a different notary, a mobile notary service Derek had apparently called to come to the hotel that night, and the witnesses listed were Stephanie and a hotel employee, neither of whom had any prior relationship with my father. Harold, visibly uncomfortable, said he could not in good conscience validate the document, but that it would need to go through the courts since it had already been filed. That was when I understood. My father did not call Derek to the den that night to revise his will out of some sudden business epiphany. My brother left the house at 8 p.m. that night not to grab dinner and make calls. He left to arrange a mobile notary, draft a new will with his own attorney on a rush basis, and come back to get my dying, heavily medicated, drifting in and out of consciousness father to sign away almost everything to him in the span of about 2 hours, on the actual night our father died, while I sat in the next room holding his hand during his final lucid moments. The fight. I'm not going to pretend the next several weeks were dignified. They weren't. I confronted Derek in the parking lot outside Harold's office, and I said things I'm not proud of, though I don't regret the core of what I said, which was simply, how could you do this to him, to me, while he was dying? Derek's defense, which he repeated in various forms over the following weeks, was that Dad was lucid enough to understand and sign the document, that he genuinely wanted Derek to have more control of the business because Derek was the one who actually understands commercial operations, and that I was being emotional and making this about feelings instead of what's practical for the business's survival. He even suggested, at one particularly low point during a phone call I had to step outside for because I was shaking too hard to stay seated, that I should be grateful he was willing to keep me on the house, since the new will technically still allowed me to live there even with the right of refusal clause, as if that was some act of generosity rather than a legal mechanism that could evict me from my childhood home whenever it suited him financially. Mark, my husband, who is normally the calmest person I know, told me he hadn't felt actual rage in years until that month. He's the one who pushed me to hire our own probate attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Diane Castellano who specialized in contested estates and elder law. Diane took one look at the timeline diagnosis, hospice status, the mobile notary, the 2-hour window, the choice of witnesses with no prior relationship to my father, Derek's own financial motive being freshly tied to a struggling real estate deal he'd quietly taken a loss on that summer, and told us, this has all the markers of undue influence and potentially testamentary incapacity. We have a very strong case to contest this. What followed was almost 5 months of legal proceedings. Diane subpoenaed the mobile notary services records, which showed the notary, a woman named Priya Patel who had no idea about the family's situation and was simply doing her job, had been booked by Derek at 8:14 p.m. that night for a 9:30 p.m. appointment, meaning Derek had started arranging this before he'd even left the house, while sitting next to our dying father, possibly while I was in the kitchen making tea. Carol, the hospice nurse, was deposed and testified that, in her professional medical opinion, based on the medication schedule and dosage logs she maintained, my father's documented mental clarity that late in the evening on October 14 would have been severely compromised by the combination of pain medication and the advanced state of his illness. She said explicitly that any document signed in that 9:30 to 11 p.m. window should be viewed with significant medical skepticism regarding capacity to understand complex legal and financial documents. We also discovered, through financial records Diane subpoenaed, that Derek had taken out a $340,000 bridge loan against a commercial property 6 weeks before Dad died, a loan that was in danger of default, and that acquiring full ownership of Donovan Heating and Air, with its $2.3 million valuation, would allow him to refinance and cover that loan with room to spare. In other words, my brother wasn't acting out of some heartfelt belief about business succession. He was drowning financially and saw a closing window, quite literally, my dying father's last hours, as his only way out. The case was headed toward trial. Derek's attorney tried to push for a settlement multiple times, offers that would have given me slightly more than the discovered new will but still far less than the original 2019-2022 will Harold had on file. Diane advised me against every single one of these offers. They know their document won't survive scrutiny, she told me. They're trying to buy your silence before a judge sees what we have. I refused every offer. Not because I wanted to punish Derek, although by that point, I won't lie, there was a part of me that did. I refused because I needed, more than I needed the money, for a court to formally say what I already knew in my bones, that my father's true wishes had been violated in the final hours of his life by his own son. The hearing and the twist. The probate hearing was scheduled for early April, almost 6 months after Dad died. I want to walk you through exactly what happened that day because this is where the story takes a turn I genuinely did not see coming, despite having lived through every prior chapter of it. Diane's strategy was built around 3 pillars: the suspicious timeline, Carol's medical testimony about capacity, and the financial motive tied to Derek's bridge loan. We felt confident. Harold Bremer was prepared to testify about the irregularities in the document's execution. Priya Patel, the notary, was subpoenaed to testify about the rushed booking. But 2 days before the hearing, Diane called me with something that changed everything. She said Harold had found something while pulling old files to prepare his testimony, something he hadn't thought to look for until the case forced him to dig through every document related to my father from the past several years. It turned out my father had visited Harold's office one more time that nobody knew about in August, 2 months before he died, alone, without me, without Derek, without telling either of us. He'd asked Harold to draft something Harold described as a letter of intent and explanation, not a legal will itself, but a notarized personal statement my father wanted held in his file, to be opened only if there's ever a dispute about my final wishes. Harold had simply forgotten it existed, buried in a different file category than the will documents, filed under client correspondence rather than estate planning, an administrative quirk that meant it never came up during the initial search of Dad's file when the dispute first began. It was only because the upcoming trial forced a complete file audit that a paralegal stumbled on it. In that letter, dated August 9, my father wrote, in his own words, witnessed and notarized, that he was aware his health was declining rapidly and that he wanted to put something on record. He wrote that he loved both his children equally and never wanted us to fight over money. But he also wrote something neither Derek nor I expected. He wrote that he had recently learned Derek was in serious financial trouble, the bridge loan, the failing real estate deal, because Derek himself had broken down and confessed it to him during a visit in late July, begging Dad for help. My father wrote that he'd told Derek then that he would not be changing the will to bail him out unevenly, because it wouldn't be fair to me, but that he loved him and wanted to help him find another way. He wrote that he was worried Derek might try something in his final days out of desperation, because Derek had, in that same emotional July conversation, asked him what would happen to the business if Dad passed before things were sorted out, a question my father found alarming enough that he wanted it on record. He wrote, "If anything changes in my final wishes that doesn't match what I'm putting in writing today, while I am still of completely sound mind, I want it known that this was not my true intention. I am leaving my estate as outlined with Harold in 2019 and confirmed in April 2022. Rachel and Derek are to split the business evenly. Rachel gets the house. I love them both more than anything, but I will not let fear of conflict make me unclear. If something different appears after I'm gone, someone took advantage of me at the end, and I want the truth protected. I read this letter sitting in Diane's office, and I cried in a way I hadn't even cried at the funeral, because in this letter, written alone, scared, and clear-headed, my father had essentially predicted his own death and the exact betrayal that would follow it. He knew. He suspected his own son might do something like this, and he tried, in the only way he could, to protect the truth from beyond the grave. Here's the twist I didn't see coming, though. When this letter surfaced, my father's August letter also revealed something else, almost as a side note, that recontextualized the entire case. Dad wrote that he'd already given Derek $50,000 in July, not as an inheritance advance, but as a private loan, off the books, withdrawn from a personal account Derek didn't know I was aware even existed, specifically to help him make a payment toward that bridge loan and buy him time. My father had quietly tried to save his son from drowning, on his own terms, weeks before he died, while still planning to keep the will fair between us. Derek never disclosed this $50,000 loan during the entire legal proceeding. When Diane raised it in the hearing, Derek's own attorney visibly didn't know about it either. You could see it on his face, a flicker of genuine surprise, which told me Derek had hidden it even from his own legal counsel. It meant that not only had Derek tried to seize the entire estate through a coerced, late-night will change, he had already received private financial help from our dying father just months earlier and never told a soul, including the lawyer building his entire case around the narrative that Dad simply wanted to reward him for his business acumen. The judge, reviewing the August letter, Carol's medical testimony, the notary timeline, and now this newly revealed financial history, ruled decisively. The October 14 document was thrown out entirely, deemed the product of undue influence executed during a period of diminished capacity. The 2019 will, as confirmed and updated in April 2022, was reinstated as the valid final testament of my father's estate. I remember sitting in that courtroom watching the judge read the ruling aloud, and I remember Derek's face going pale, then red, then something I can only describe as collapsing in on itself, the same way mine had collapsed in Harold's office 5 months earlier. There was a strange symmetry to it. I almost felt sorry for him in that exact moment, before I reminded myself of everything that had led us there. His attorney asked for a brief recess before the judge had even finished reading the full order, presumably to manage what was clearly about to become a very different conversation between the two of them once they were alone. What struck me most, sitting there, wasn't even the legal victory itself. It was watching the judge's expression shift slightly as she read portions of my father's August letter into the record, a flicker of something almost personal, like she'd seen hundreds of estate disputes in her courtroom but rarely one where the deceased had so plainly anticipated his own betrayal and built a paper trail specifically to defeat it after death. She actually paused at one point, looked up over her glasses, and said something I'll never forget. It is rare that the court hears so clearly, in the decedent's own words, exactly what did in fact come to pass. Mr. Donovan appears to have understood his family better than perhaps anyone gave him credit for. That line stayed with me for weeks afterward. My father, a man who fixed furnaces and coached soccer badly and cried at weddings, had quietly outmaneuvered both the law's usual blind spots and his own son's desperation, simply by telling the truth early and trusting a system to eventually catch up to it. He didn't need lawyers or schemes. He just needed time, and as it turned out, even dying, he gave himself enough of it. Derek did not go to prison. This was a civil probate matter, not a criminal fraud case, though Diane did tell me we could have pursued elder financial abuse charges separately, and for a while I considered it. In the end, I didn't. Not out of forgiveness, exactly. I think I just didn't have anything left in me for more fighting, and some small part of me still loved my brother even through the wreckage of what he'd done, the way you can still love someone while knowing you can never fully trust them again. Where things stand now. It's been 8 months since the ruling. The business was split evenly, as my father always intended. Though Derek and I no longer manage anything together, I bought out his half at fair market value using a portion of my inheritance, with Pete, Dad's longtime general manager, staying on to run daily operations. Donovan Heating and Air still has my father's name on the door, and I made sure it always will. I had a small brass plaque made for the front office, right by the entrance, with a single line on it. Founded 1989 by Walter Donovan. Built on honesty. Stays that way. Pete cried when he saw it installed. So did I, a little, though I tried not to let him see. Derek and I speak maybe twice a year now, mostly logistics, mostly stiff. Stephanie reached out to me once, months after everything settled, in a long, complicated text that was part apology, part defense of her husband, part her own grief about how the whole situation had strained their marriage too. Apparently Derek's financial secrecy had been a problem in their relationship long before any of this started. I didn't respond to most of it. I didn't have it in me. I will say, though, that I believe her when she says she didn't know what Derek was planning that night. I think she found out the same way I did, just a little earlier, and by then she was already standing too close to the wreckage to do anything but try to survive it alongside him. There's a version of this story where I tell you Derek reached out, eventually, with a real apology, the kind that doesn't come wrapped in justification or business logic, and we found some fragile way back to each other. I wish I could tell you that's what happened. It isn't, not yet anyway. The closest he's come is a single voicemail he left around Father's Day this year, his voice cracking in a way I hadn't heard since we were kids, saying only, "I think about that night a lot, Raj. I'm sorry. I don't expect anything from saying that. I just needed you to know it." I haven't called him back. I might, someday. I haven't decided. I think about my father's August letter more than almost anything else from that entire period. Not the betrayal, not the legal fight, not even the moment I found out what Derek had done. I think about my dad, alone in Harold's office, sick and scared, choosing to spend some of his limited remaining strength making sure the truth would survive him even if he couldn't survive his own illness. That's the version of him I try to hold onto. Not the man dying in a bed while his son arranged a rushed notary in a hotel parking lot. The man who, months earlier, quietly tried to save that same son financially while still refusing to let fear and love distort what was fair. I've thought a lot about why I'm sharing this story publicly, beyond just needing to process it. I think it's because so many people assume estate disputes are simple, greedy squabbles between siblings who never really loved each other in the first place. That wasn't my story. Derek and I really were close, once. People are capable of loving someone and still betraying them when fear, desperation, and money collide in just the wrong way at just the wrong moment. I don't think my brother is a cartoon villain. I think he's a person who got scared, made a catastrophic choice in the worst possible hour, and then spent months building a justification sturdy enough to let himself believe it was fine. But here's what I keep coming back to, the thing I'd want anyone reading this to actually take away: my father knew something was wrong before any of us did. He felt it coming, and he protected the truth anyway, quietly, without drama, in a lawyer's office on an ordinary Tuesday in August, just in case. If you take nothing else from this story, take that. If something in your gut tells you a family member might do something you can't yet prove, write it down. Date it. Notarize it if you can. You might be wrong. I hope you are. But if you're not, you'll be glad, the way I am every single day, that someone you loved chose the truth before it was too late to matter. My dad died on October 14th. He was buried with his army dog tags, a photo of my mom in his coat pocket, and, though almost nobody besides me, Harold, and a judge will ever know this part, the quiet, unwavering integrity of a man who made sure that even his last act on this earth was an honest one. I miss him every day. And somehow, knowing what he did in that August letter, I think I miss him even more than I would have otherwise, because it proved, one final time, exactly the kind of father he always was.